it's an echo chamber and there's no one to actually question or challenge you from what your preconceived notions are, because we often don't actually know what our preconceived notions are until someone challenges us.
Are you feeling overwhelmed, stuck, or uncertain about how to grow your business without sacrificing what really matters most? Welcome to The Business You Really Want, the show for women ready to build a sustainable, fully aligned business. Aligned with what, you ask? You, your values, your life. Seriously, it is possible. I'm Tonya Kubo, and along with business advisor extraordinaire Gwen Bortner, we're here to show you how. Do you have business connections surrounding you that look just like you? Same industry, same business side, same challenges. I know that there's a lot of comfort in similarity, but today, we're going to explore why stepping outside of your usual comfort zone, your usual business circles, might actually be what you need to do to get to that next level of success. I'm Tonya Kubo, joined by my absolute favorite business advisor, Gwen Bortner. And today we are tackling something that we have both observed individually and collectively repeatedly in our work with business owners, which is the tendency to stay in our comfort zones when it comes to business relationships. Now, Gwen, you and I talk about this all the time, right? I talk about analogs versus anti-logs. And particularly, there's these business environments where I think you've even felt like the odd person out, where people are like, why are you here? Because what you do is not like what we do. I would love for you to just kick us off first by sharing maybe what you've gotten out of being in community with business owners who are very different from you. And then we can talk a little bit more about why folks lean into this idea that they have to hang out with same industry, same business size, yada, yada, yada.
Okay, but I'm going to kick it back to you first and say, give a quick definition of analog versus anti-log. Because the first time you used that, I had never heard that term. And I generally consider myself pretty well educated about these kinds of terms. And when you explained it, it was like, OMG. I mean, like, it was a really important understanding of what that difference is. So take just a moment and explain analog versus anti-log.
Yes. Okay.
In this context.
Right. And I'll have to find the original person who came up with this for our show notes. So analog are things that are similar, right? So if I'm a service provider, I'm a marketing professional, right? And if I want to look at similar services, maybe I'm going to compare my pricing to somebody else, right? I am going to go look at other marketing professionals, and maybe I'm going to look at community strategists, but maybe I'm going to look at chief marketing officers. So those would all be analogs. I'm looking at the businesses that are similar, and I'm specifically looking for the similarities. Anti-logs are when I look at entirely different business models, entirely different industries, and go, what are they doing to make themselves successful that I could apply to my business model? And as a result, maybe be on the cutting edge of things, or maybe avoid this big hole that my peers or my collaborators are in.
So it's so funny because once you explained it, it took me right then, it harkened me back to a very early conversation as I was starting to develop this particular business. I've had multiple entrepreneurial businesses and whatnot. And the gal I was talking with, I had done I'm going to say an anti-log answer, where I had grabbed something out of a completely unrelated industry, talked to her about how I could apply it into her industry and why it would work and all of the things. And she said to me, "You're such an out-of-the-box thinker." And I heard what she said, right, obviously, but it didn't really resonate with me because I don't think of myself as an out-of-the-box thinker. I know I'm creative, but I'm not creative in the blank canvas kind of way, right? And then I started chuckling, and she said, "What?" And I said, "No, I just know what's in everybody's box." And she said, "What do you mean?" And I said, "I've worked with so many industries, right? So I kind of come at most of the work I do as an anti-log, even though I may be a business advisor and there's lots of business advisors out there. I approach it from an anti-log perspective. So when you first talked about this, which I don't know, this was years ago now.
Yeah.
I know it was after one of our quarterly tune-ups because we were talking about why it works. And you're like, oh, it's because of the anti-logs. I'm like, what? What's that term? What does that mean? But there is power in it, and there is power in the analog as well. Now, given all of that, I've totally forgot what the original question was that I was supposed to answer, but I feel like it's still a good lead up.
It is still a good lead up, and I'm going to insert myself here for a moment, and then I'll bring us back to the question, because I think our question, I have to scrunch down to look at my notes, but is really these experiences and how they've affected us individually, but also how we see them affect other businesses. And, for me, I first started doing this when I worked in higher education because I had a newspaper background and, in journalism, a little bit about everything and not much more. Right? Because there is no benefit in you doing a deep dive and becoming super expert in one company, unless it's a huge company that is making the news all the time, right? But you need to know enough to educate the general public about a lot of things. And then when I got into higher ed, they wanted me to bring that same perspective into higher education, right? Into the work that I did to promote the good work of the university. However, anytime I would have an idea, the answer I would always get is, well, who else is doing it? I would be like, well, what do you mean? And they'd say, well, we can't take that idea to leadership unless you can show us it in action at other universities that are 3 times our size, 3 times as old, blah, 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 blah. And then it got to where oh, actually that wasn't even good enough. I couldn't find some private college that was 200 years old that had success in this. It had to be other universities within our university system. And I remember that whole time struggling, going, well, first of all, how are we going to make a name for ourselves if all we're doing is copying the university that's 50 years older? And by the way, that means these processes are 50 years old. And because they're so much larger, they can't shift with trends like we could because we're small. And so that was frustrating, right? It was like, okay, but if we copy them, we're just going to have the same problems they have and be 50 years behind it. Second, hi, 21st century university, and you want me to practice 19th, 20th century if I'm lucky? Marketing practices? This doesn't make sense. So that's where it first started. And, I eventually got myself to a position of authority and credibility within the organization that they let me dip my toe into innovation every now and then. But primarily what I was able to do is take a lot of what online business owners were doing, specifically with email marketing and social proof and social media, and apply it to the higher ed space. And no, we didn't create complicated sales funnels because that's not appropriate to higher ed, right? But we could take some of the you first language, right? Voice of customer language into our emails and dramatically affect the outcome of those emails. So that was when I started using it, was all the way back then. But time and time again, bringing us back to this conversation, here's why I think we have to have an episode on it. Because to this day, and we are now in 2025, in case you're listening to this several decades in the future, if we're around that long, I'm still in rooms where, say somebody's making an offer and the first question that pops up is, well, does that work in the health and fitness space? Or I need to know how many other authors have been in your program and have had this success, or I need to know how many other product-based business owners have this success. And really what we're saying is if you can't show me 22 other retailers who have done this, then there's no way anything you say can have any validity for me as a retailer. And I want you to tell me now, Gwen, why that thinking is wrong.
Well,
or why it's right, because I shouldn't just feed you my opinions.
Well, yeah, you should, because that's what we do here. And my answer is what, it always is yes and, or both, right?
Yeah.
Because there are some situations where the thing they're doing really doesn't cross over a particular line.
Right.
And using a very, easy kind of to distinguish a physical based business, a brick and mortar business versus an online business. There are things that will totally work in one and won't work in other, or will be exceedingly hard to do in the other, back and forth, right? So there's a point that question can be super, super valid, right? But also if I haven't seen it done by 1,000 other people, then I don't believe it can be done, right? And I'm obviously exaggerating here, but is also completely wrong, right? Because using the example that was actually happening that I used at the beginning of this, the gal I was talking to was in the web development space, and she was developing membership sites for people. And she was getting paid, I'm going to say a flat rate. I mean, it was probably a time and materials rate, but she was getting a price, X amount of dollars. But what she was seeing is that her membership site was allowing them to create these huge incomes, because she was still in there doing some maintenance and some other things and whatnot. And she's like, I'd rather get more of that. And so basically what I talked to her about was a royalty model. Right? Because she had access to actually have the numbers to know what kind of the numbers really are, right? And it was like, so what if you reduced your base price, but then said ongoing maintenance is a percentage of this, or, we talked about a couple of, and she was like, that will never work. No one's ever done that. And it's like, well, no, and in my mind, what I was like, this is basically just the book royalty model.
Right.
That has worked for decades, if not centuries. I have no idea how long it's been in place, but it's a very, very well established practice. But at this point, no one had considered the possibility of using that in this web development space.
Right.
And so it felt like no one has ever done this. It couldn't possibly work. Where in my mind, it's like, no, hundreds of thousands of people have done this. It will totally work. Just it hasn't been done here.
Right. And, to that point, I mean, let's talk about one of the best examples of this, which would be Netflix.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Right? So, Netflix says, okay, well, you can subscribe to movies. Like, remember back in the day when they used to come little DVDs at your house? Yeah. And then they went to this online only model, which, if you think about it, isn't that much different than a gym membership.
Right.
Right?
Or any membership.
Well, but back then, if you think, we got to go way back here.
Yeah.
At that time, it was most like a gym membership. And it's like, okay, well, that's never going to work, right? Because there's not a brick and mortar space, but it did. And then now we've got software. You talk all the time. Actually, let's be honest, you complain all the time about how you used to be able to go to the store and buy your TurboTax box or buy your Adobe box, take your box home, spend half a day uploading your software, but you owned the software for as long as you licensed it. Fine. But you had that, right? Access to that for as long as you wanted until you decided to upgrade, right? But your old version would still work. Your old Quicken, your old Windows, whatever would still work. But now everything's software as a service, right? We subscribe to software. We pay. I was looking at Adobe just the other day, right? Like $20 a month forever. Now the upside is I never have to worry about spending all that time updating my software. But the downside is that as long as I want to use that, I'm paying a regular fee. And I bet there was somebody somewhere going, this is never going to work. Nobody is going to pay an ongoing access fee for software. Nobody's going to pay an ongoing access fee for design templates. But yet we've got memberships of everything all under the sun. And it's all because people saw Netflix do something that they thought would never be done.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely true. And if you and I sat and thought about it for probably more than 15 minutes, we could probably come up with hundreds of these. I'll call them cross-pollination examples, right? probably even more in the recent time, but even in old times, right? There truly are very few people that are what I'm going to call 100% innovative.
Right.
Right. Where they just get this idea and say, I think this can work. I'm going to figure out how to make it work. Most of us, our creativity is, I see A, B, and C, and I see a path between them, or I see where they cross, or I see how they connect. And what if we, and it's more what I'm going to call the Netflix model, right? Where Netflix, someone at Netflix said, oh, I don't know what they said, but, gym membership, could we do that? It's those things where we're like, oh, I'm taking A and B and C, and I see how they work together, and I'm pulling them together in a new way.
Yeah.
And so there's lots of it out there, but most of us have trouble identifying it.
Yeah.
That's actually what's happening. Right.
Right. And I think it goes back to this idea that we believe that people have to, especially in business, right? That, I hear this all the time with real estate agents, for instance. Real estate agents believe that the only business advisors that can help them are business advisors who work exclusively with real estate agents.
Right.
Or, work primarily with real estate agents. So what I'd like to talk a little bit, so I addressed early on what I believe is like the biggest cost of like networking and communities, which is it's really hard to get ahead of any trend if all you're doing is sticking with, your similar businesses, similar industries. Do you think there's any other costs associated with, I guess, homogenous networks?
Truly homogenous networks, and this is really what you're saying, but they become an echo chamber. Right? We're hearing the same thing, and when someone says, yeah, I really struggle with that, everyone's like, oh, yeah, we totally struggle with that. It becomes very difficult for people to pull out of it. At the same point, there is some value in the homogenous network when you're needing it shortens your conversation time. You say ABC and everyone's like, I know what ABC is. You don't need to explain it in a big, long, involved way, right? So there's pros and cons. But I think one of the challenges is that we also forget that these analogous networks are also not just by industry. Right? So being in a network where everybody is at the same stage of business that you are. So they could be in all completely different industries, but they're all at the exact same stage. It's also an analogous network, right? It's just a different kind of analogous network, right? Or, we talked about the distinction between a brick and mortar style business and a, purely online business. And of course, there's really kind of a third one, which I think of as home service. It's not necessarily home, but plumbers and technicians and, all of those, they're kind of brick and mortar, but they're kind of service, but they're not online. They're like a halfway kind of, so saying, oh, well, they don't have anything for me may be true, but maybe not. Right. Because that's a place where it's like, yeah, that doesn't apply exactly to you, but what if you took this, sliver of what they're doing and apply it to you, right? So I think there's another form of this analogousness that we discount, sometimes. And so to me, the challenge, like I said, more than anything is that it's an echo chamber and there's no one to actually question or challenge you from what your preconceived notions are, because we often don't actually know what our preconceived notions are until someone challenges us. They just seem like facts or truths. And to some degree they are. Right? But it's back to they are within this box.
Yeah. So I want to kind of talk about the value of the different perspectives, like what you've seen. But I'm curious, do you have any examples of different perspectives maybe solving old problems?
So one of the things I occasionally teach a class on how to build your own mastermind network.
Okay.
And this is the example I use of this is that. And what I say is for a really good mastermind network, there usually needs to be some element of analogousness, right? It could be we're all women. It could be we're all at a certain stage of business. We could, I mean, like it doesn't, I'm not saying there is a correct one, but there usually needs to be something so that there's some amount of either common experience, common language, common something that you aren't having to explain every aspect all the time.
Right.
Right. But I also say a really good one also has an element that's very specifically anti-log, because that's where the fresh idea comes from, right? And so years and years and years, I mean, like literally now, decades ago, I started my own mastermind network when I was working as a professional instructor in the knitting industry. And my analog piece was I wanted other women who were really taking their business seriously and were trying to run their business as a business. Because in the craft industry, there's some people who are really doing their business kind of as a hobby and not making any criticism of that.
Right.
That's fine. Right. But that was where I wanted everyone to kind of be, this isn't just for fun. It really needs to make money. It needs to be profitable. I'm doing this, in a nearly full-time-ish kind of way. That was that. But for my anti-logness, I said, we all need to focus on a very distinctively different craft. So I was the only knitter.
Got
There
it.
was
Okay.
a weaver. There was a quilter. There was a clothing fabric, handmade clothing design, right? These were where the differences were, because what happened in the conversation is someone would pull a completely common practice out of one side of the craft industry. And all of a sudden you can say, oh, I can totally apply that to my industry in a different way. And so years and years and years and years and years and years and years ago, I did one of the very first mystery knit-alongs. They are so common now, like everyone on the planet does them. That is like, it is common practice. Right?
Okay.
When I did it, as you've experienced as my marketing person, I was being highly innovative, which made it very hard to sell, and people did not get it and did not understand. But where I had taken it was out of the quilt industry, which had been doing a block of the month thing probably at that point for decades. Right. So it was like you give a piece, every month along the way. And some of the block of the months had started to become mysteries, where it was like you don't actually get to know all of the pieces. You only get to know the piece as each month as it gets revealed. And people were loving it because it was like, it's really fun, because I don't have to pre-anticipate. I get to, I get to, learn as I go, and I don't talk myself out of something because I say, oh, I won't be able to do that. That's too hard. Right. And so that was something I pulled out of a completely different industry. And when I did it, it seemed highly innovative. But back to, it was just a common practice over in this other industry. And so that was the importance of having this anti-log group to be able to talk about things and see those things and go, oh yeah, we could totally do that.
Yeah. Well, and I think also sometimes the different perspectives, I don't know how else to say it other than they see things in your business that you don't. So I spent years in a mastermind, all women, right? That was what we had, the same, all online business, except everybody else was a product-based business, right? Digital products. And I was the only service-based business. And I remember that initially being told like, oh, that's a bad investment. You should only be in groups with service providers. But one of the challenges that I had was like, I was trying to figure out things that were easier, right? A little bit more automation without fully automating, right? Because I like the high touch service. And so for me, being in this room full of digital product-based businesses, I learned so much, right? Because some of them had, these like evergreen newsletters, and others of them had these ad strategies and all of these things. And then I could kind of pick this and pick that and go, oh, okay, well, I like this idea. I like that idea. Back then when I joined the group, service providers didn't have email sequences much. They didn't really do a lot of newsletters, because the idea was somebody comes to your website, they hire you or they don't, right? But in this arena, I was like, oh, well, there is a benefit to having 5 or 6 emails that somebody gets after they subscribe. Then kind of gets them at least to know you a little bit better, right? Simple idea. But I think what I've also seen, especially with your clients, because your clients are all women, but they have very, very different business models.
Very different.
I see a lot of normalization, right? Somebody thinks they're the only person with a problem. And because everybody's in these different business industries and sectors and such, stages even, the person comes in and it's like, oh, I'm a terrible business owner because I have this problem. Everybody's like, oh no, that's a pretty universal problem. And then they all talk about, this is how this problem looks in my world. And then somebody else says, this is how this problem looks in my world. And they kind of go around the circle, and then they start talking about ways to solve it. And that person goes from thinking that this problem is proof that they have no right being in business to going, oh, all these women I look up to that I think are 5 steps ahead of me are either in it or have overcome it. And now I'm walking away with 5 different options for solutions.
Well, and one of the things that we offer to our clients and our, what we call our alumni, our past clients, is this very intense but truly small focused group called the Savvy Syndicate, right? And so it's limited to 4 people maximum plus me. And so that's part of it, is it's really, really small group. And we're together for 2 days where, we are in it. We are in a beautiful but isolated, space, literally in the middle of a vineyard. I mean, it's gorgeous and all of those things, but there's really nothing to walk to. There's nothing to go. There's
no distractions is what I like to say.
Right. Yeah. There's no distractions. And the last one that we had, which was at the beginning of this year, our 3 people that were there, in this case we had 3, were all very, very different. One has a business that she's growing really fast, and I'll be shocked if it's not an 8-figure business, in the next year or 2. Like, I'll just be shocked if that's not the case. Another person who has a very successful business, but it's basically she and her partner, because they're providing a service. They don't need this whole giant team. That's not the way their business works. And then our third person owns a brick and mortar shop, right? So these are all very different business models, right? And yet we found commonality. That was one some places where the languages were common, and they were always in very unexpected places, which was interesting, and very, very different, very, very analog. And just yesterday we had our kind of follow-up, wrap-up conversation. And in this environment, typically, the retailer always feels like they're not doing as well, because the retailers I work with don't have 18 locations. They usually have a location, possibly 2. They are a smaller, an independent, smaller retailer, right? And it's like, oh, I'm not as successful as. Well, okay. First off, I never believe that, because success is based on our own definition.
Right.
And as she got on the call, she was like, yeah, I feel like I haven't done well since the event. But because we have a weekly reporting, I had already looked at her weekly reporting. And the thing was, what she viewed as not being successful, I responded back to her, and I shared with the group, because there was a really close relationship there. It was like, it doesn't feel successful because it doesn't look like their success, but it is exactly 100% what you wanted and you would not have been able to do otherwise.
Right.
And when I shared it with the other two, they're like, that's amazing that you're able to do this, because the other two haven't been able to do that particular thing. Right. And so it's one of those things that it allows everyone to see how success is different. Right. And to also for others to be able to give feedback and say, oh my God, I would love to be able to do that. Where you look at the person who's potentially going to be making an 8-figure business. It's like, oh, that's success. And it's like, that's just a partial definition of success. That is nowhere near 100% success.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, and I think what you're saying, right, is in these spaces, they get to come together and first of all, see that, because I think we all tend to think the grass is greener on the other side.
Oh,
right.
It must be a human condition. I mean, really,
yeah, exactly. So we get to see like, oh, this person who I think is 5 steps ahead of me, they feel like I'm 5 steps ahead of them in this other area. Right. We all are seeking something different, right? Because I don't think anybody pursues a business development program of any sort, whether it's a one-to-one consulting relationship, a coaching, a course, whatever it could be. Nobody pursues that because they think that they have everything figured out and they just want to go into the room and have it validated that they figured everything out, right? We all go in with some gap that we want to fill. And so seeing that everybody's gaps or perceived gaps are different, I think is really powerful. Now, I'm going to turn this one on you a bit because I happen to know, because I work with you, that you intentionally put yourself in a lot of rooms where you're a bit of a unicorn. And, so I'm curious in your perspective, or maybe just from your experience, how do you go about finding opportunities in these places where they're a little bit uncomfortable because maybe nobody knows that you're awesome sauce in your industry or your sector, or, they don't know that you have all this accomplishment or acclaim. So what do you do to find the right opportunities there?
There are a couple things that I try to be aware of. So one is if I'm 100% comfortable right off the bat, I know that that's going to be a different kind of room than a room that I am uncomfortable. Yeah. I have a new friend, Hannah Abad, that I've met in one of these rooms. And one of the things that she shared with me recently, which I've been sharing with others, is we have to learn to regulate that uncomfortable is not dangerous, because our amygdala says uncomfortable, which usually is more of a gut response, means there's actually a tiger in the bush there about to pounce on us. Right? From, what feels like a long time ago, but really in the scheme of evolution is, in time really is not that long ago. Right? But for, most of us, 99% of the time, uncomfortable is not actually dangerous. It's just uncomfortable. It's unknown. It's right. So part of it is saying it's okay to be uncomfortable. It's okay to be uncomfortable. And so part of the reason I can find these rooms is because I also don't try and hang with my exact tribe all the time. Right. So there's people who are talking about an experience being in another room, and it's like, that seems like an interesting experience. And so I ask them more about it, and it's like, does that feel like it's so far out that it won't be valuable? Does it feel like it's actually closer than I want, or is it somewhere in the middle? Now, the other thing that will happen is, because I do speaking and workshops, sometimes I end up in places as a paid or invited person into an environment that's not really my environment. Right. But because my natural, setting is highly curious, let me learn more about your industry. And I'm really good about being able to say, oh, now I understand about your industry, I can apply it over here. And I love to be able to give more relevant examples when I'm doing these kind of presentations. I see that as an opportunity to like, okay, I'm just going to dive in and see what I can learn, right?
Yeah.
And so both of those things allow me to see it. Now, the thing I've learned is in most circumstances, unless it becomes highly, highly obvious that it doesn't make sense for me to stay, I also try to commit to 3 years.
Ooh, say more about that.
Unless it's something that's meeting on a really, really, really regular basis. But, if it's where there's a big event once a quarter or a big event once a year, and there's a couple other things, what I've learned is that first year is really trying to get a lay of the land and get a feel for things. And so making all of your judgment on that usually is not useful. The second year is where you actually start building relationships and being able to see whether or not it's going. And then somewhere around the third year is where you can say, oh yeah, this is going to have long-term value or not. Right? And so I tip it, and I've talked to several other people, and a lot of people actually use the 3-year guideline. Like I kind of randomly came up with it, but it appears to be kind of a good guideline. Now, not saying that I've stayed in everything for 3 years, because occasionally there's something that's like, this is not my world, right? That being said, one of my good friends years ago, I was asking him something about, tell me what you find unique. It was one of those exercises that someone had given me to do, and it was like, oh, he's spent enough time with me, he'll give me some good insight. And what he said, and it was interesting when he says, you're one of the only people that I know that can actually hold two absolutely conflicting thoughts in your head without freaking out about it. and he said, and not necessarily having to decide which one is right. To be able to just let them sit there, which I think allows me to be in these anti-log environments.
Right.
Easier.
Yeah. Right. And so I want to speak to the introvert listening, because I know my introverted friends. Because, some of this...
I care about the introverts.
I know you do.
But I really care about them.
But I also know that there's some of my introverted friends would listen to you and say, well, that's easy because you're an extrovert, right? Extroverts love to go into rooms. They love to talk to people, introverts, not so much. But the thing is I happen to know that we introverts, we value deep connections. We have a hard time with small talk. But we value, one-to-one conversations and being able to build those relationships. So I would say, when it comes to finding opportunities in uncomfortable spaces, I'll give you my little introverted tactic that doesn't involve talking to anybody, my friends, which is simply when other people are sharing, right? Or in any of these environments where somebody has the opportunity, like for hot seat coaching, is I leave a page of notes where I write down all the things that I am getting out of. I'm learning that I could potentially apply from what's being shared there. I don't have to talk to anybody for those insights, right? It's that social learner piece of me. So that's one thing I'll do. The other thing that I think is really valuable, especially when you're looking to build these meaningful relationships with people in different industries, is I seek out people who I just find interesting. Right? If I am curious enough, I will figure out something that makes sense. And maybe, you know what? They're not very curious in return, in which case it feels one-sided and it's not worth pursuing. But a lot of times we actually find that our biggest similarity is the mutual curiosity.
Yep. Nope. That makes perfect sense. And as you said, you don't have to approach it in I'm going to meet everybody in the room.
No.
You can absolutely say, I'm coming into this room and I'm going to meet 2 people. I'm going to meet 1 people.
Right.
Right. It doesn't have to be a big giant number. And keep in mind that although the world presents extroverted, I am confident that there's actually more introverts than there are extroverts.
Oh, Susan Cain will tell you that. She wrote books on it.
Right. Yeah. And
Yeah.
I've read, I've read her first book about that. And part of it is our culture here in the United States kind of rewards extroversion.
Right.
And when people say, oh, I'm an ambivert, what I always say as they describe it, it's like, no, you're mostly introverted, but you're nearer the middle of the introverted scale. And so it's easier for you to do some of the extroverted things. But as they describe, it's like, no, you're primarily introverted, and there's nothing wrong with that.
Right. Nothing wrong at all.
Nothing wrong with that. You don't need to justify it. There's nothing wrong with that. And introverts generally are way more interesting than extroverts like myself. Because they'll go deeper faster.
Yeah. Okay. I thought you were going to say because they always leave a little mystery. Okay. So before we close out, Gwen, I'm curious, do you have any tips for how to approach learning from businesses that aren't like yours? Like maybe let's just leave us with like 1 to 3 tips. Doesn't have to be a lot.
So one is to let go of the words that would never work, right? Or that's the way we've always done it. Get those out of your head, right? Because when you're in that space, you can never be looking for this innovative, how do I take this and twist this? Right? So that would be my very first thing is you've got to let go of that would never work, or, this is the way we've always done it, kind of a thing. The next is also understanding that the thing that you're potentially pulling from somewhere else probably won't fit exactly. To say, what is the core idea? What is the nugget of the idea? And then how can we fit it in? Because it often still is a little bit of, a square peg round hole thing. But it's like, oh, it's mostly the same size. And if we just shave off these couple of corners, it will fit. But not just saying, oh, it's square, we're round, never working. Right? Although I don't think that's always the right answer, because context matters. But being able to say, a couple adjustments here, this thing would actually fit. Right? And, if we're using square peg, I could say, square peg versus octagon, right? You shave off 4 corners and all of a sudden that thing does fit. But you have to be creative and say, what am I doing and where? And then the third, which you just referred to, earlier on, is the curiosity factor. Just always being curious and seeing why, right? Why does this work for someone? Because often, if you're curious and get less worried about the specific tactics, but actually take it up a level and look at the strategy, or even up a level more and look at the principle, then you can say, oh, I can take this and then bring it back down into my world. It'll look very, very, very different, but it's still grabbing something from the outside and bringing it in. And then I just thought of another one is when you're in these environments, don't be afraid to ask, and also listen for people who are willing to ask what I'm going to call the dumb question. Because the person who doesn't know will ask a fundamental question because they don't know, which will start making you think about your world differently. Yeah. Right? When we had one of our first quarterly tune-ups, there was someone who was a retailer working with someone who was a service provider who knew nothing about what the retailer's business, was about, the specialty retail business. And when they came back, they said, the service provider who knew nothing asked me a fundamental question that no one in the industry would have ever asked me that totally changed my thinking. But the service provider said, I felt really stupid asking the question. But it was actually the best question that was asked. Okay. I love that because, so as we wrap up talking about really it's the hidden cost of staying in a business echo chamber. What you've talked about is, number one is just being open to possibilities. And part of being open to possibilities, like you said, is not being afraid to ask the dumb question, but also
not tuning out when somebody asks the dumb question or the beginner question, because it can open up your whole way of thinking. And I would say, while it's natural to seek out people who think like us, what we're really talking about is that the real magic happens when we connect with those who see things differently. And I am going to say, dear listener, if you are ready to break out of your business echo chamber, but you're not sure where to start, a great first step is Insight to Impact, which is our weekly premium accountability subscription that helps you gain clarity on your business one reflection at a time. Every Friday, you get a thought-provoking question designed to help you examine your business. And when you respond, you get personal feedback, usually from Gwen, sometimes from me, to help you implement positive changes. Head over to everydayeffectiveness.com/impact to learn more. Thanks for tuning in to The Business You Really Want with Gwen Bortner. I'm Tonya Kubo, reminding you that sustainable success is within reach. Make sure to subscribe to the show and visit thebusinessyoureallyWant.com for more resources. Until next time, keep dreaming big and acting with intention.